He was trying to talk. He did want to talk, but he didn't actually verbalize any words. I always, that's gonna be one of the biggest mysteries in my life, because he was trying to tell me something.
I can tell right away he's in bad shape. He's bleeding out of his mouth and nose. He's got multiple torso hits. There's a lot of blood. There's so much blood, I can't even tell exactly where he's hit, because there's just, he's bleeding so badly.
Nurse finally speaks out about Tupac's shocking last words before his death. A nurse who treated Tupac Shakur during his final days just broke decades of silence. And what she revealed about his last words changed everything we thought we knew about September 13th, 1996. For nearly 30 years, the world believed Tupac died without saying anything meaningful, that he slipped away in a coma surrounded by machines and mourning family.
She said that the doctor said that Tupac was going to survive, and she said that Tupac's family was already setting up plans to send him to Arizona so he can go to rehab.
But this nurse, who was in that trauma unit for all 6 days, claims Tupac was awake far more than anyone admitted, and the things he said in those final hours weren't random pain-induced mumbling. They were calculated, deliberate, and absolutely terrifying in what they revealed about who really wanted him dead.
Of course, I don't think she's, fabricating anything. I think it might have been something where he definitely would have had to go to rehab, because they removed his lung and stuff like that.
The nurse, who agreed to speak only under the condition of anonymity due to legal concerns and personal safety, worked the overnight shifts at University Medical Center in Las Vegas from September 7th through September 13th. She remembers the chaos when Tupac first arrived, gunshot wounds bleeding through temporary bandages, Suge Knight screaming at doctors to save him, and an atmosphere so tense that security had to lock down entire hallways. What she didn't expect was how lucid Tupac would be during those first crucial hours after surgery, or how the things he said would haunt her for the rest of her life.
By the time I got there, he had tubes in his throat, in his nose, in his mouth. So he ain't talked to me, not verbally.
But what Tupac told her during one of those late-night medication rounds would reveal he knew exactly who set him up, and it wasn't who anyone expected. According to the nurse, Tupac came out of anesthesia around 3 a.m. on September 8th, roughly 6 hours after his emergency surgery to remove his right lung. Most patients in his condition would be incoherent, struggling just to breathe through the pain, but Tupac's eyes opened clear and focused. He asked where he was, whether Suge was okay, and then said something that made her blood run cold. "They got me good this time, didn't they? Took them long enough?" The phrasing stuck with her because it wasn't shock or confusion, it was resignation, like he'd been waiting for this moment and was almost relieved it had finally happened.
He was conscious. He was trying to talk. He did want to talk, but he didn't actually verbalize any words.
She checked his vitals, adjusted his IV drip, and tried to keep him calm, but Tupac kept talking, his voice raspy from the breathing tube but surprisingly strong. He told her he'd been shot before, that he knew what dying felt like, and this time was different because he'd walked right into it knowing something was wrong. He mentioned the fight at MGM Grand, said he tried to avoid going to Las Vegas entirely, that he'd canceled the trip twice before Suge convinced him it was mandatory for death row business. Then he said something that made the nurse realize this wasn't just street beef gone wrong, it was something planned from the inside.
Doctors sometimes even thought that he was gonna survive. When I seen him, he was sedated. And when I seen him, I knew it was more real than, what was being relayed to us.
And what he said next about Suge Knight would completely flip the script on who was really behind that white Cadillac. Tupac looked directly at the nurse and said, "Suge knew. He had to know. You don't sit in traffic that long without knowing something's coming." She didn't understand what he meant at first, but Tupac explained that when they got stopped at the red light on Flamingo Road, Suge had positioned the car in a specific way, passenger side exposed to the street, engine running but not moving even when there was room to pull forward. Tupac said he noticed it in the moment but thought he was being paranoid, that the shooting happened so fast he didn't have time to react. But looking back from that hospital bed, the setup felt obvious.
He was trying so hard. He was shaking the bed. He was looking at me, with his big old eyes, and I know he was trying to tell me something, but I don't know.
The nurse asked if he told the police this, and Tupac laughed, a painful sound that turned into coughing. He said cops had already been to his room asking questions, but he told them nothing because talking to police was pointless when the people who wanted him dead had money, power, and connections that reached into every corner of the industry. He specifically mentioned that Suge's crew had been controlling who got access to his room, screening visitors, monitoring conversations, and he believed they were making sure he didn't say anything that could implicate death row records in what happened.
Why Afeni pulled the plug because of his condition, but I mean, it would be more appropriate since you was his brother. Afeni, her decision to pull the plug on him, from your point of view, what made her pull the plug?
The nurse documented this conversation in her personal notes, but never included it in the official medical records because she didn't know what to do with information that explosive. She was a trauma nurse, not a detective, and getting involved in what sounded like a criminal conspiracy terrified her. But over the next few days, as Tupac's condition worsened and he kept waking up during brief moments of consciousness, the things he said became more specific and more disturbing. But the confession he made on September 11th, 2 days before he died, would reveal the real reason someone wanted Tupac's silence permanently. During one of those late-night shifts, Tupac woke up disoriented and in severe pain, his body rejecting the medications they were pumping into him to keep him sedated. The nurse was alone in the room adjusting his morphine drip when he grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong for someone in his condition. He pulled her close and whispered that he'd been planning to leave death row, that he had evidence of financial crimes Suge was involved in, money laundering and payoffs to gang members for protection and violence. He said he'd copied documents, recorded conversations, and stashed everything in a safe location that only a few people knew about.
Because he had already flatlined a couple of times. And she didn't want him to keep going through that.
Tupac told her he'd been working with someone, he didn't say who, to build a case that would expose death row's criminal operations and free him from his contract. He believed that's why the shooting happened when it did, because word had gotten out that he was preparing to walk away and take other artists with him. The beating of Orlando Anderson at MGM Grand wasn't random stupidity, it was theater, a public incident that would give street credibility to his murder and make it look like gang retaliation instead of an industry hit. The nurse asked why he was telling her all this, and Tupac's response was chilling. Because if I don't make it, somebody needs to know the truth. They're going to say it was Crips, East Coast beef, all that bullshit. But it was business. It's always business. He made her promise that if he died, she would remember what he said, that someday when it was safe, she'd tell people what really happened in that hospital room. And then came the moment that broke her, the thing Tupac said right before they put him back into a medically induced coma that he'd never wake up from.
So I think it was like twice before she, let him go. And that's reasonable. You know what I mean?
On September 12th, doctors made the decision to sedate Tupac heavily because he kept trying to pull out his breathing tubes and get out of bed, his survival instinct fighting against a body that was shutting down. Before they administered the medication, the nurse was in the room checking his bandages when Tupac opened his eyes one last time. She asked if he was in pain, if he needed anything, and he shook his head. Then he said, "Tell my mom I tried to get out. Tell her I knew it was coming, but I couldn't leave without finishing what I started. And tell her to look in the locker. She'll understand." Those were the last coherent words she heard Tupac speak. Within hours, his vitals began crashing, his body going into respiratory failure that the medical team couldn't reverse. The nurse was there when Afeni Shakur made the decision to stop resuscitation efforts, when the machines finally went silent, when the most powerful voice in hip-hop took his last breath at 4:03 p.m. on September 13th. She watched Suge Knight's people clear out of the hospital within minutes, watched Afeni collapse in grief, and watched police investigators show up too late to ask the questions that might have actually mattered.
When I was, when I found out, I could live with it more,
Yeah, man. Sad, man. I heard if he would have survived, he would have never been the same Tupac.
For years, the nurse stayed silent about what Tupac had told her during those 6 days. She was terrified of retaliation from death row associates, worried about violating patient confidentiality laws, and honestly unsure if anyone would believe her. But watching the murder case remain unsolved for decades, seeing Keith D get arrested in 2023 and claim Orlando Anderson was the shooter, watching the narrative get twisted into gang violence instead of industry conspiracy, she finally decided the truth needed to come out. So what does her testimony actually prove? And why did she wait almost 30 years to reveal what Tupac told her before he died?
He's still alive, still breathing. Because some people, it sometimes comes up, well, why didn't she give him CPR? Well, because he's still breathing. You don't give a breathing guy CPR.
The nurse explains that she tried to go to authorities in 1997, reached out to Las Vegas Metro Police detectives working the case, and told them she had information about Tupac's final statements. They took her report, asked a few basic questions, and then nothing happened. No follow-up calls, no request for detailed testimony, no interest in pursuing the angle that Tupac had been set up by people inside Death Row Records. She believes the investigation was deliberately steered away from anything that might implicate Suge Knight or expose the criminal enterprise operating under the cover of a record label. What makes her account so credible is how specific the details are. Things she couldn't have known unless she was actually in that room having those conversations. She remembers exact times, specific medications, the names of doctors who rotated through Tupac's care, and small personal details like the CD player next to his bed that played Vincent by Don McLean on repeat because his fiancée believed the music would help him heal. She kept personal journals from those 6 days, notes she made after each shift, documenting not just medical observations, but the emotional weight of watching someone so young fight a battle he was always going to lose.
Mother, because she's very strong, positive. And the way she was explaining to us, he's okay, he's gonna be okay. And I think everybody thought he was gonna pull through.
The reference to the locker in Tupac's final message to his mother has never been publicly explained, and the nurse admits she has no idea what he meant by it. But given everything else Tupac told her about having evidence against Death Row, about copying documents and recording conversations, it's reasonable to assume he was referring to some kind of storage location where he'd hidden proof of the crimes he'd discovered. Whether Afeni ever found what he was talking about, or whether it's still sitting somewhere waiting to be discovered, remains one of the many mysteries surrounding Tupac's death. What's most heartbreaking about the nurse's account is how clearly Tupac understood what was happening to him, how he'd pieced together the setup even while bleeding out in a hospital bed. He wasn't some reckless thug who got caught slipping by enemy gang members. He was a smart, calculated individual who'd figured out he was trapped in a situation that was going to get him killed, and he tried to create an exit plan that he ran out of time to execute. The business documents, the evidence against Suge, the plans to leave Death Row, all of it suggests Tupac was preparing to blow up the entire criminal operation, and someone decided to silence him before he could.
If I'm not mistaken, he died on the table one time in surgery 3 times, and they kept bringing him back to life multiple times. I try my best to be clear as possible, but I know it happened multiple times. And after a while, his mother was like, you know what, just let him go.
The nurse's decision to finally speak out comes at an interesting time, right as Keith D's murder trial is scheduled to begin in February 2026. Prosecutors are building their case around the theory that the Southside Crips killed Tupac in retaliation for the MGM Grand beating, that it was street justice carried out by gang members defending their honor. But if the nurse's testimony is accurate, if Tupac really did tell her he was set up from the inside, then the entire prosecution narrative falls apart and the real conspiracy gets exposed. Whether her account will impact the trial remains to be seen. Defense attorneys could use her testimony to argue that Keith D and Orlando Anderson were just convenient scapegoats, street soldiers used to carry out a hit that was ordered by people much higher up the food chain. Prosecutors could dismiss her claims as unreliable memories from a traumatized witness who's had 30 years to be influenced by conspiracy theories and media coverage. Either way, the fact that a medical professional who was actually in that hospital room is now contradicting the official story adds a new dimension to a case that's already full of contradictions and unanswered questions.
Instant snap. He went from being, trying to yell, trying to squirm, trying to get Suge's attention, to he just went totally peaceful. Like he just totally stopped. And, you could tell he reached a point where he physically gave up.
For the nurse, Speaking out isn't about getting attention or cashing in on Tupac's legacy. She's refused payment for interviews, declined book deals, and insisted on anonymity to protect herself and her family from potential retaliation. She simply wants the truth on record, wants people to know that Tupac Shakur died knowing exactly who betrayed him and why, and that his final words weren't the confused rambling of a dying man, but a deliberate attempt to leave behind evidence that would eventually lead to justice. Whether that justice ever comes, whether the real people responsible for planning his murder ever face consequences, she can't control. But at least now the world knows what Tupac said in those final moments, and history will have to reckon with a truth that's been buried for far too long.